Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Community-Led Storytelling and Engagement. I'm going to give everybody just 2 minutes to go ahead and hop on. We'll begin our presentation at 2:32. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Community-Led Storytelling and Engagement. My name is Olivia Haas, and we're coming to you live from all over the Atlanta region this afternoon as a part of an ongoing series hosted by the Atlanta Regional Commission. You can visit our website to find past webinars and to register for upcoming sessions. I'll post a link to ARC's webinar library page in the chat box in just a moment. First, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we jump into today's session. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee control panel. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer screen in the upper right corner. Throughout the webinar, you will have the opportunity to submit text questions or comments by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session. You can also see chat messages from us in that window. Like I said, that's where I'll send the library page for the ARC webinars. One thing to note is that for our current meeting, all attendees have joined in listen-only mode. So you will be on mute during today's meeting. So if you do have a comment or question, please go ahead and submit that into the question box. A few other quick notes. If you do click away to another application or browser and you have trouble finding our meeting again, you can look for the blue flower petal. It's this icon in the middle here. In your ribbon bar at the bottom or side of your screen, or look in one of the open browser tabs. The orange colored arrow on the control panel for the software will collapse and open the control panel, and you can move it to another part of the screen if desired. Today's meeting and all of the ARC webinar series will be recorded through the GoToWebinar platform. This recording will be made available to all meeting attendees via a follow-up email and will be posted to the ARC website. Okay, now I would like to turn it over to Sonam Vashi. Sonam is one of 6 co-founders of Canopy Atlanta, a community-led journalism nonprofit founded in 2020 that includes stories chosen, produced, presented with Metro Atlantans. She's also an award-winning freelance journalist and lifelong Atlantan. Welcome, Sonam.
Hey, everybody. I'm about to present a slideshow. I think Max is going to put that on. Let's see. Awesome. So I'm just going to intro everyone real quick. Here are the 5 people that you'll be hearing from today, and the 4th one from the left. We're Canopy Atlanta. So we are a nonprofit journalism newsroom that was founded this year. If you just continue a little bit. Next slide. And here's our agenda for today. So we're going to start with a discussion about community-led journalism between Canopy Atlanta and City Bureau, which is a nonprofit media group in Chicago. We're going to then move into a case study of Canopy Atlanta's community engagement methods in our pilot community in West End. And then we're going to do an interactive exercise to talk about community engagement practices. And just a reminder, today is Giving Tuesday, so you're going to hear from a lot of great nonprofits today, including Canopy Atlanta. If you're interested in donating, you can go to that link on the bottom, canopyatlanta.org/donate. Next slide. So just really briefly about us, we are a community-powered journalism project. Basically, our mission is to make journalism more collaborative, involving Metro Atlantans, particularly people from communities that have historically been underserved by legacy media, in the process of reporting and telling stories. Next slide. The way we do that is basically by making every stage of the journalism process collaborative. So first, the community, in this case West End, helps us choose story topics through phone conversations, through front-end community engagement. And then we'll go into this into more detail, but a smaller group of folks take the topics that were chosen and even refine story angles. Then we pay and train residents from that community, our fellows, to tell their community stories on the topics that were chosen in collaboration with paid journalists as well. And then we present those stories in and with the communities. Next slide. We've done this in a way that takes a lot of inspiration from some really amazing other groups. You'll hear from some of these, how we've used some of these strategies a bit later. One that we've taken a lot of inspiration from is City Bureau. So City Bureau is a nonprofit civic journalism lab based in Chicago on the South Side. They were founded in 2015, so about 5 years. They are celebrating their 5th year anniversary this year. And their mission is to bring journalists and communities together in a collaborative spirit to produce media that is impactful, equitable, and responsive to the public. They do that through civic reporting fellowships. They do that through a program they call Documenters, which pays and trains residents to attend and publish notes on public meetings. And they have a public newsroom program with events that are basically open spaces for sharing resources or working through local issues. City Bureau has trained hundreds of documenters at this point and more than 100 reporting fellows whose work has inspired protests, policy changes, conversations across Chicago and around the world. And so joining us today, we're really excited to have Daryl Holliday, who is one of the co-founders of City Bureau. And we're going to stop presenting and just have our two beautiful faces on the screen. If you don't mind. There we go. Awesome. And Daryl, would you mind turning your camera on? Hey, Daryl. We're all learning this webinar panel stuff. So Daryl is a journalist, participatory media advocate, and media entrepreneur based in Chicago. Again, he's a co-founder of City Bureau and their News Lab director. And the News Lab is a civic journalism lab. And he manages the Documenters Network and does impact evaluation efforts across the organization. So we're really excited to have him for this conversation about community engagement. How are you doing, Daryl?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to talking to y'all.
Awesome. Yeah, we are. So we're talking all about community engagement today. We really wanted to have y'all on because I think that just from the guidelines that you've published in your reporters notebooks and all, like you're really just like at the vanguard of a new conversation around community engagement, which I think we all really appreciate. But I would love to hear from you, just kind of like, because community engagement is such a huge part of what y'all do. I mean, how did you approach forming City Bureau with seeing some of the issues in journalism at large, or particularly in Chicago, in terms of how they approach community engagement? Like, how did that form City Bureau in your mind?
Sure. I mean, it was integral to the shaping of the organization. Like you mentioned, we were founded this group in 2015. There were 4 of us originally, and we practiced a co-leadership structure. So it was a journalist, an editor, an educator, and a publisher. We often tell the joke, like so and so walks into a bar, and what do you get? You get City Bureau. So the intersection of those things, public education, reporting, quality, factual, accurate work, and publishing distribution. That is where we sat, early on, and still do in a lot of ways. There were issues that we were addressing in Chicago that I think apply across the board in this country. The 4 points that we had laid out on day one was that City Bureau was founded to address inequitable, misrepresentative local reporting, a lack of diverse perspectives in newsrooms, a distrust of media, especially within communities of color, and business models that were not shaped to support that kind of work. And I think the alternative of that, the flip side of that, is I think what your question was getting at, which is how has journalism approached communities, and why do we need sort of a intervention or solutions? I mean, what I see here in Chicago, and I think other places, is a big focus on deficit reporting, to be pretty frank about it. And by deficits, I mean the opposite of assets. Reporting that, reports on crime, but nothing else in the community. Reporting that finds the issues, what's wrong with a people, a block, a neighborhood, and hones in on that without the holistic vision of what is really going on in that community. I mentioned distrust earlier. We often talk about people distrusting journalists. I would argue that the opposite is maybe more true, or comes first. Journalists often don't trust people. I think we see that in types of reporting that we get. And the last point here, and I'll stop rambling, is democracy. These are the 3 Ds. I would love to see more democratization of journalism. I think when we think about how journalists approach communities, it's usually it can be extractive. And when I say democratizing journalism, I mean, how do we bring people into the production process, into the creation process, into the distribution process? What would a journalism look like that takes community engagement to its furthest end, and brought many more people into journalism itself?
That's amazing. You just hit on all the topics that I feel like we're just about to spend the entire hour talking about. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I love that so much. So just kind of going back a bit, I'm sure many people who are attending or watching this webinar have heard of ABCD, asset-based community development. I just don't think that's a framework that's always applied to journalism or just storytelling in general. I mean, and I know there's a lot of people interested in a variety of different storytelling methods on this webinar too. People who maybe are doing it through a sort of marketing lens, or people who want to tell us stories about what their nonprofits are doing better, or even journalists themselves. I mean, why do you think? I love what you said about journalists not trusting people. I mean, where do you think that comes from? And I'm sure this can be applied beyond journalism as well. But where do you think that kind of distrust? How do you think it started getting framed in this way that people don't trust journalists, and where do you think the distrust? What do you think that's exacerbated by?
I mean, I think it's always been in journalism. When we think of the gatekeeper model of media, journalists are fair, objective, accurate. We know where the information is, and we impart that to you, our reader, and then we'll see you again the next time we have a newspaper, for Sunday edition. I mean, that sort of looking at people primarily as consumers as opposed to producers, I think has always been built into how the industry is shaped out especially as it professionalized over the years. And I think a lot of those things are. It makes sense to me. A lot of those things I just mentioned, objectivity, professionalization of media, are things that we push back on at City Bureau. We're journalism school in a lot of ways, and we're not charging thousands of dollars for a degree in journalism. We in fact pay our reporters to work because that lowers the barriers of entry to everyone. We see right now a media industry that does not reflect the people that it serves. It's wider, it's more male, it's more sits all the things that you can think of. Media tends to be a bit more homogenous than the communities that it serves. So how do we address that? What are the interventions for that? And then we get right back to ideas of objectivity and how do we distribute the skills that journalists have among as many people as we possibly can. That's what I think about at City Bureau often, is how do we host more trainings? How do we get more folks paid? How do we democratize this space? And that to me feels like sort of it's more of the opposite of distrust. We're telling people, because we trust you, we trust that when you come into this field, this industry, when you have agency and you own an information system, that makes journalism better.
Yeah, and I know you run Documenter. Can you tell us a little bit more about like how Documenters functions in that? You're saying like how you give people the tools to actually, or not give, but like the sort of reporting skills. Like what are those actually? When we kind of, I think a lot of us try to pretend that like what the skills that journalists have are these things that like took years to develop, which in some cases is true, but sometimes it's like, no, I just know where to find this information on a website really well, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the skills that journalists have are extremely valuable. The thing is that individually, anyone can do them. Like journalists may use all of them or use a lot of them, and that's a skill, sure, absolutely, and it's put to good effort. But how to use your cell phone as a recording device, anyone can do. How to interview someone, anyone can do that. How to write, how to edit, how to fact check, these are all things that anyone can do. They might do all of them, but they can learn them all. So at Documenters, we've been running the program for about 4 years now. And the nutshell version of it is that we train anyone, and then we pay people to monitor, attend, document public government meetings. So your city council, your police board, or justice advisory council, all of the various layers of committees, subcommittees, advisory councils. There are dozens of meetings happening in Chicago any given week. Most of them are not covered. At a good percentage of them, real things are happening. Big decisions are being made, and they might not show up at city council until 3 months later, but they're percolating in these smaller committees earlier. So our idea is there is a huge untapped resource or potential in the public to rebuild that civic bridge a bit, to go to these meetings, to work in collaboration with reporters, whereas one newsroom likely can't be at all of these meetings. Documenters can, because there are 2,100 people who have accounts on documenters.org. Any given week, there are around 120 who are actively applying for assignments through our technology. So yeah, I mean, I think what we're building is it's hard to explain sometimes. It's a new public record. It's a new community of practice that I think embodies a lot of the values that we've just been talking about: participatory, building trust in communities, thinking about assets over deficits, and democratizing the space.
I just love how, like, yeah, I can think of at least like 10 different councils and meetings that like no one goes to, even prior to the pandemic, and I just love like the like entire universe of applications that greater access, because y'all like Documenters often live stream some of the meetings too, or live tweet some of them. Is that right? Yeah.
Yep, they're live tweeting. They're taking notes. They're taking photos, audio, video. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, what are some of like the real world impacts that you've seen of that greater reach and participation in documenters?
Yeah, I think of it in two parts. When we began documenters, we're journalists, right? We could have began it with journalism in mind, with the goal of either creating journalists or making more content, but we didn't. What we did do was we began with the community building, with the system, like what is the mechanism by which we're able to get people assignments to a meeting and then back to our tools to share it. So we had to build out an entire website for this that has a full backend, a message board, and at this site, we're all digital now, so we can't do as many in-person events as we were. But even now, we see documenters meet each other and they create book clubs. Like they create projects. Like there's new networks being built. That sort of generative quality is really what we were in it for in the beginning, and now that it's growing, people are meeting each other, they're having new ideas, they're having conversations. Now City Bureau is able to look at the reporting and the content and say, how do we make what documentaries are producing most useful to community organizers who are going to these meetings, who need to know ahead of time what their points are because they're trying to create actions around certain issues, with reporters who are trying to cover this stuff, to educators who, the list goes on. How do we make what documenters are producing most useful to them? And that's our current challenge, our current puzzle, our big question.
That's a great puzzle to have, for sure.
Yeah.
And I know this, documenters is only a part of like the various community engagement programs and initiatives that you have, but I mean, I just love, when we were figuring out or as we are still figuring out how to do Canopy Atlanta, we keep returning to this amazing, we should have put links somewhere, so someone can put it in the chat. I love this. If the City Bureau has like community engagement guidelines that are just like really wonderfully boiled down, and earlier you were talking about this idea of extractive community engagement. I mean, I really love. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit? Like, what does it mean, and particularly like a storytelling or reporting context, to be extractive, and how do we, and what are some ways to guard against that?
Sure. There is a great guide on non-extractive reporting that I'll pop into the channel in a minute. I think I tell it to all of our fellows to document anyone I can, basically. But I mean, extractive reporting, and I don't want to get back to what I was saying. I'm sort of like a salty journalist sometimes, where I'm like, oh, why is the industry like this? But it's one of those things that I think, again, has always been present in the way that a more professionalized journalism industry, media industry, has done business, and that would be that we need to churn out stories to put ads on those stories, and the best way to do that is to be fast, to have a breaking news alert. And what speed can do, I'm not saying all quick pace, but that a false sense of urgency, I think, can lead to that extractive quality where people become pieces of your reporting, and that more holistic look at who they are, what troubles are, what are they going through, how can we be most useful, how can information most serve them. That kind of goes by the wayside when you have to turn around a story in 2 hours to beat the Tribune. And journalism can often get caught in that rat race where then everyone is trying to beat everyone, and who's looking at the public, who are public advocates in journalism. So our community engagement guidelines, these were led by one of our original co-founders, Andrea Hart, who's now at Divinity School. And I think you can, I say that because I think you can make the connection between why she is in Divinity School and these community engagement guidelines. But it's talking about taking time, resisting false urgency, being asset oriented, all the things we're talking about now, we tried to embody them in these guidelines.
I love that. Yeah, there's a love thy neighbor kind of feel to them, for sure. And I know we only have a few minutes left, so if anyone has questions, there is a way to share them, so please go ahead. But you know, I know you also do a lot with evaluations and trying to think about like what impact is for City Bureau. How do you approach evaluating your community engagement?
Definitely a work in progress. We spent all of last year basically beginning from scratch. I mean, when City Bureau began, there weren't many blueprints for how to do this kind of work. And now, you know, that there's you all, like, we love what Canopy Atlanta is doing, we love what Outlier Media is doing, we love what the Devil Strip in Akron's doing. Like, there are so many more of us who are really thinking along these lines, and I expect that there'll be even more. So when we began thinking about impacts, we had to start from the beginning. And we went through a literature review process. We talked to people in our community, and ended up with these 4 buckets. And I mentioned one earlier, this idea of generative relationships. How do we generate a network, even if we are not the center of it, which we typically, you know, we always aren't? How do we support people generating ideas and solutions that may come through City Bureau but not be wound up in City Bureau? How do we distribute civic knowledge? How do we make information systems more resilient? And then everything falls from that. You know, then we're looking at what are our team goals? How do they respond to these higher up objectives? What are our individual staff goals? How do they respond to team goals? We have an impact tracker where we're logging the sort of more qualitative things that don't show up in numbers. You know, it's easy to count clicks, but clicks won't tell you what someone did about your story or your work. So whenever we see those things, we're tracking them manually and saying, this is real world impact from our work, and we can celebrate that. We can think about how we do it better, and we can track negative impact. I think is important also. What did we do that didn't work, that made someone's life more difficult? And how do we respond to that and repair it? And yeah, it's another big puzzle. How do we reimagine impact and evaluation for this kind of work is something I love talking about with folks, because it's new. It's kind of happening right now.
You know, you say it so simply, but like that tracker is like a really just genius idea. And I love that you all approach it in a way that is like so non-defensive, which I feel like, especially when you're in this kind of like, you know, equity space, you're like, no, I'm doing the right thing and you just don't get it, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, you have to actually take this feedback, you know, like really.
I mean, that happens, right? Because once you start really engaging folks and you know, share power with them, that is going to happen. People have ideas, and they have big ideas, and they have a different way they want to do stuff. You have to navigate that, like that idea of learning how to be uncomfortable and comfortable in that, and finding ways through this like good kinds of conflict. Those are the things that Andrea really left with us, you know, before she went to divinity school. And I mean, we've taken it to heart, and it's proven true every time. You build a network, the network becomes sentient, you know, like it has its own thoughts that you can't control and shouldn't control, because that's the power of it.
I love it so much. It's like probably the only time I've heard like sentient networks said in a way that's like really positive and not scary.
That Terminator situation.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we're just out of that time, although next time we should just have, it looks like we might have some questions in the chat. Let's see. I don't think I can, here we go. I'm just gonna share one question and then maybe we can raffle. So the question is, with documenters, how do you train people or give them the tools to make sure they're knowledgeable about what they're covering so that the information they're sharing is accurate and useful? I ask this because many committees, commissions, et cetera, are complex and can be hard to navigate.
Absolutely true. They can be quite complex. You mentioned this in the question, actually. Training. We do trainings on just on the structure of government itself. We do trainings on Freedom of Information Act requests. How do you FOIA an agency? Trainings on note taking. Trainings on the legal underpinnings of, you know, the fair report privilege and the Open Meetings Act. So the answer here is just continual trainings, one-on-one sessions, And now the network's growing. We have programs, documentary programs in Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit. There's one in Fresno. It's more important than ever that we lock down this way of going about the work, because it's once we do it here, it exports. So yeah, the short answer to that question, I won't take up too much time here, is training, absolutely, and fact checking and review and editing.
Love that. Well, Daryl, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. You're just like a fountain of knowledge, and we're just really grateful for it.
I'm happy to be here. I love what y'all are doing, and yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm going to turn it over now to Camille Whitaker, who is another Canopy co-founder. Camille is our fellowship and training director, and is just a general joy. So I'm going to turn my video off and let her take it from here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Daryl. That was wonderful. Thank you, Sonam. So yes, I'm Camille Whitaker. I am one of the 6 co-founders of Canopy Atlanta, and I served for this issue as the fellowship director. So we'll get into that a little bit later as we walk through the nuts and bolts of what went into producing Canopy Atlanta's inaugural issue, which focused on the historic West End neighborhood. So to start, it's important to say that we planned to start our processes officially in March of 2020. And then the coronavirus hit, and the world was experiencing what we call, or what could only be called, like a racial reckoning. And we had to rethink everything from community engagement to programming from the top down. So in the weeks leading up to our launch, that was the question that we were asking. Can we pull off meaningful community engagement in the midst of a pandemic? The answer that we arrived at after turning it around over and over again for a couple of weeks is that, Canopy Atlanta is needed now more than ever. So what we did to adjust is that we gave ourselves time. We slowed things down, we stretched out our timelines, and like Daryl mentioned before, resisted, false urgencies. We, committed to building relationships, and that was the foundation for the work. So first and foremost, we wanted to make sure that we weren't reinventing or trying to replace or supplant ways that residents already exchange information. So we used values that groups like City Bureau already crystallized. We wanted to find ways to tap into West End's existing information systems. That was of utmost importance to us. And if you look at the slide, we looked at various places. First, we wanted to know, where did West Enders gather online? Especially, considering the pandemic. We found that West End's neighborhood Facebook group was pretty active. So we made sure to engage there a lot, and also to link up with the moderator and the creator of that group, who happens to be Brent Brewer. And you're going to hear plenty more about Mr. Brewer later on in this segment. We also looked at involving ourselves with the neighborhood infrastructure. So talking to NPU leaders, presenting at neighborhood association meetings and group meetings. We listened while in lines at popular eateries and gathering spots on Ralph David Abernathy. We involved existing community-focused media, such as the print version of our West End newsletter, also conveniently run by Brent. And the newsletter had been publishing in the neighborhood for decades, hand-delivering copies to residents. So their digital and real-world relationships ended up being invaluable to us. More on that later. And we were able to link with photographer Melissa Alexander, who had been doing this beautiful photo series during the pandemic called the Pull-Up Sessions, where she basically captured residents in their element, candid shots, pose shots, and she ended up being featured in a couple of resulting stories. We connected with and left flyers at businesses, and with appropriate safety procedures, we canvassed some of those locations. But this one right here, one of the final ways that we started to engage the community was to tap into something that we knew that was, special and unique to West End. On summer evenings, neighbors are on their front porches. And so we canvassed during those times. And during that, actually going and speaking to residents, longtime residents, we were able to reach people we wouldn't have been able to by just focusing our efforts on online or social media. And so from that, we learned that understanding the unique context and features of a neighborhood really helped us to begin this process and to build a real. So to make the most of our engagement, created a listening form, and this next slide will show a little bit about what that looks like. The listening form asked questions like, what are the most important issues facing your neighborhood, and what information do you need right now during the COVID pandemic, and how can local coverage about West End be improved? Questions about trust in local media and trust in hyper-local media with regard to West End specifically. So we posted the form on social media, but few people from West End filled it out. And we realized that you can't really expect people to come to you that way. So of course, the aforementioned porch method, we went about it that way. And we did something that City Bureau kind of laid the foundation for us, and that is to invest time and energy in building these relationships over a long period of time. And because we particularly wanted to hear from long-term residents and folks who weren't always served by legacy media, we did a lot of that over the phone as well, in addition to our porch talks. So we used some resources created by the group Press to build something like a pseudo phone tree, where Canopy staff and volunteers first called folks we knew or who represented the neighborhood, like a Brent Brewer or the neighborhood association vice president, and had a conversation that asked questions on the forum, but also ventured into all other kinds of subjects, if you can imagine. And at the end of every conversation, we asked, can you tell us who else we should be talking to in West End? And then we get their confirmation and their contact information and go from there. And I can tell you that yielded so much in terms of resources and sources and stories and narratives. And the conversations took a lot of time. And sometimes they were short, sometimes they were long, sometimes they were over the course of a couple of weeks, anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours. But it was one of the most rewarding parts of the process, I think, because both because of the relationships that we built, of course, and the intimacy that was cultivated in those moments and that continued on throughout the process, but also because so many of the great story ideas and sources that were shared, we wouldn't have heard them otherwise. So we got detailed information from about 60 West End residents this way, and more than half of those were residents who had lived in West End for more than 10 years. So that was key. And before I move on to talking about us building the community advisory board, because that was the next step in the process after doing the listening, I wanted to just pause and just let you know about some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of what we want to do with community engagement going forward. Right now we are in collaboration and strategic planning and evaluation mode. And so even though we're a little more attuned to our new COVID normal, so to speak, and we're thinking about our next cycle and thinking about ways to enhance community engagement. And so some of our immediate goals that we have for engagement, or what we call the listening part of our processes, happen to be things like mass texting. For example, Outlier Media in Detroit uses platforms like Ground Source to communicate with residents directly about what kinds of information they need. So that would include things like helping people access property records when they're having issues with vacant homes, or providing information about how to dispute your water bill if it's incorrect. And so that's going to be really important as we continue to be socially distant, to be able to access and connect one another in that way. Also, listening posts, and this is what I'm really excited about, to think of like having a recording device that you can maybe leave at a library or some other public space where residents can record themselves, sort of like a DIY oral history. They can tell a story, or if you leave a leading question like what's something you need help with, or what's one of the most important issues in your neighborhood that your neighborhood is facing, they can record their answers. And we're seeing that lots of groups are using these listening posts, and these are groups that are functioning even outside of journalism spaces. And then, of course, when it's safe, having in-person events or listening booths that we operate in public spaces in the neighborhood, like coffee shops or MARTA stations, etc. And so going back to how we went about it. So after the listening portion, we and after seeking out the larger community feedback, we asked residents to apply to our community advisory board. And actually, this was during the process. So, while we're asking questions about what are the careabouts, for your neighborhood, we're asking, like, are there any ways that you want to participate in this at a deeper level? And so we intended for the community advisory board, when we were envisioning this, we intended for it to be sort of like an assigning editor for the stories that we would end up reporting and publishing about the West End. So we chose 7 community advisory board members out of the many that applied, and we chose them through a rubric that it evaluated applicants on factors like the duration of residence in West End, involvement, general awareness. And additionally, we were really adamant about making sure that the community advisory board, because of the role that it was going to play in framing these stories, that the community advisory board represented the diversity of the community, demographically speaking. So we actually used the ARC's Neighborhood Nexus to get metrics about those factors, about West End specifically. And this is actually something that we have discussed that we would like to do better next time. One of the things that we found is that our board, our community advisory board, was almost exclusively composed of people who own their homes, even though West End is it's a renter-heavy neighborhood. And you'll see where that comes up in a little bit as we kind of discuss some of the stories that came out of the Community Advisory Board. We presented the Community Advisory Board with the feedback garnered and yielded from the listening sessions and the listening forums and the conversations that we had with the greater West End community. We collected the information from social media posts and different commentary on, neighborhood boards. And then we had the meetings, 3 very, very robust discussions over Zoom with the Community Advisory Board members, and we narrowed down those topics into specific story angles. So if you can imagine just all of the information coming in about what are the important issues for West End, and then narrowing them down to about 6 that we could assign to journalists as well as the fellows for the fellowship program. So for example, a topic like gentrification, we heard specific angles like what was going to be going on at the West End Mall and how community members could affect big development deals. And we have been challenging the terminology about of gentrification. And you can see where the demographic representation would be important here for the nuances of those discussions. A homeowner versus a renter might feel as if they have a different stake in those discussions. So that's something that we discovered further down the line, and something that we're going to be thinking about seriously going forward. And so at the end of the meeting, the Community Advisory Board came up with the 6 prompts, and we took those prompts and assigned the story. So if you look at the slide, you'll see this is an example of one of the the prompts that we kind of that the community advisory board came up with, and this happened to do with community policing. And so every part of the process, if you see how it comes from like the questions that the 7 members asked to the prompt that we ended up distilling, every part of the process came directly from the community. And as a staff of full-time journalists, we knew that we had to exercise journalistic restraint because, you know, in certain cases or in traditional media, journalists might have their own views about what they thought or what they think are the key issues in a particular community, but that didn't matter. You know, thinking about it in that way wouldn't have been mission aligned for Canopy. And I want to point out here that this is a departure from the way that traditional newsrooms function. Typically, you had a staff editor that would assign a story to a writer on something they think is important. The writer would go in and report and leave. You know, very little intimacy would be cultivated. And Sonam and Daryl were talking about extractive journalism, and that's pretty much the model that is occurring in traditional newsrooms today. But with Canopy's model and the model of so many of the public newsrooms and nonprofit newsrooms that are coming up, you know, we safeguarded the community input, and we made that our North Star at every step of the way. I can't stress that enough. At any point in the process, if we had a question about what was relevant or how much weight we should lend to one particular source or data point, we every time went back to the Community Advisory Board's mandate and asked, how does this answer the questions that the community wanted answered? That's what we did to guide our process. So that led to the next portion, which will be, which is the fellowship. And as I mentioned before, I directed the fellowship program for the issue. And Marianne Martin, who you will hear from after me, she actually facilitated the community engagement process that I just spoke of. So going forward, so we have our 6 prompts. 4 of them we assigned to local journalists, and we chose 2 to assign to the fellows because we ended up choosing 6 fellows. And let me back up because I want to bring in Adrian. Adrian is one of the panelists today, but she was also a fellow. And before we actually go out of the slide, let me just explain a little bit about oh yeah, this is perfect. Let me just explain a little bit about just the nuts and bolts of the fellowship and how to become, how residents ended up becoming a fellow. Hey, Adrian. To become a fellow, residents had to fill out the application, like Adrian had to as well, that asked about relevant experience. It asked about connection to West End, previous opportunities to access journalism training, and interest in journalism, in community journalism concepts. So we chose 6 community journalism fellows for this cycle. And that can change. We might go more in the future or less in the future, depending on what the information needs of the community are. And they each received a stipend to participate in roughly 6 weeks. I say 6 weeks because it's been a little bit longer. And they learned the fundamentals of reporting from some of the region's top journalists. So we have pictured, Brent Brewer, who ended up becoming one of our fellows. He, like I mentioned before, is the publisher of Owen newsletter. We have Naya Clark, who is an arts writer and journalist. We have Ayana Clark and Zinga Clark. They are both working in the nonprofit space. Adrian is a photographer and a documentarian. Abu Bakar, a photographer as well. So as you can see, we didn't have a group of professional journalists, and that wasn't our intention. We had a group of storytellers and creators that were already telling the stories of their surroundings. So we were just looking to shore up that storytelling journalistically through training on journalism fundamentals, focused mentorship based on existing and desired skill sets, and step-by-step guidance all along the way. So Adrian, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm so excited to have you here. you, of course, were one of the members of our inaugural cohort of fellows. So could you basically walk us through what the structure of the fellowship was in terms of like the week?
Yes, and first, just want to give a thanks to ARC for hosting this today's platform, and special thanks to Canopy for this amazing fellowship. Good afternoon to everyone who's joining us. But yeah, my name is Adrian Coleman. I live in the Oakland City community of the city of Atlanta, and I think to start off, I think I just want to do an introduction of myself because I think it speaks a lot to Canopy. I'm a 64-year-old grandmother living on the south side of Atlanta, and to be part of this fellowship kind of speaks to thinking outside of the box about who has something to say. Our first week in the journalism program, Camille introduced us to the concept of bonji, which is a concept that kind of laid out the structure for how we were going to interact internally within Canopy, but also to the greater community that we were hoping to be able to serve through this fellowship. And that concept speaks to a space in which every individual has a voice. And this is an intellectual power that serves as a continuation of knowledge and tradition. And that foundation came in our first week, and it laid out our interaction with each other, but also spoke to the intention of Canopy that this is about service to our community, and also recognizing that we each have unique skills, and Canopy's role was to facilitate us into exposing our own gifts, but bigger than that, exposing the strengths, the intellectual power of our community and the traditions in our community. So with that, we started on a 6 weeks course that, as Camille said, it was in the middle of a pandemic. So we started with Zoom sessions over the course of 6 to 8 weeks. And week one led into just the fundamentals of community journalism. So that we all are speaking the same language and had the same expectations of what this process was going to be. Week two, we jumped head into research and fact finding, and that was led by Max Blau. That was the intention was turn every page. You don't go to one source and believe that. You keep peeling it away. You turn it and you look at it from different angles. Does the data support what the community thinks is happening in the community? So it was turn every page, keep looking. Is there another angle that you can approach this from? We also, Camille Whitaker was one of our mentors, and she talked about interviewing. Media law and ethics. Ethics was something that was really rooted in this fellowship in terms of that we want to be accurate, we want to be truth tellers, and we should also drop our assumptions. Don't lead by assumptions. Let the data, let the facts be your North Star in this. And quite honestly, it also taught us to be curious, always curious in this process. So we've lived in these communities, but a lot of it, once you start researching and looking at the historical data, using finding data such as census data, all this different information, it gives you another level, another exposure to your community. And a lot of it was eye-opening that you're finding out about your community. The next thing was journalism isn't one platform, right? It isn't just print. And when we talk about print media, what type of story are you talking about? Is it long form? Is it essay? So you can't use these words to really describe what journalism is. But within that, you also have different platforms. There's photojournalism. There is podcasting now. There's all these different types that can lend itself either separately a photo essay can stand on its own, but also photos embedded with a good story just elevates that story. So there's lots of ways to be able to share and inform our communities. And then came the storytelling piece, right? And writing and the craft of writing. That writing is it's part science. I mean, it is part, this is the structure, you know, how do you do that, and how to be able to shape a story for a reader, and how to make it compelling, you know, so that people will follow you along on this journey. And throughout this whole process was the word accountability. Accountability back to accountability to each other. As fellows, we felt an accountability to each other. We had homework assignments, we had deadlines throughout this process. So we had an accountability to each other. We had an accountability to Canopy Atlanta for this investment of the fellowship, but also back to the advisory board and largely to the West End community, that we wanted something that they could, first of all, use. We wanted the information that we found, that we presented on their behalf, was going to be informative and something that they can use, but also that the advisory board and the leadership, we met their requirements and what they had laid for us in terms of the assignments. And so the fellowship was a great experience, and I can say today, you know, it hasn't ended for me, and for the fellows it continues, and so it's constantly evolving, and so it's not 6 weeks and you're out.
Right, right. Yeah, we're going to talk about how it's continuing for you. One thing I want to talk about before that is, you know, you mentioned the dynamic that we kind of laid as the foundation, and one of the things that I loved to see was, you know, when you conducted your own workshop at the very beginning, and not only that, but we had the living syllabus where you and the other fellows were constantly putting in resources and information. Talk a little bit about like the dynamic of that, and what that kind of revealed to you about the process of community journalism.
Well, the process in the first week, you know, a lot of times you go into different, you know, educational forums, beyond fellowships or the more structured, where it's teacher and student, right? In this case, Canopy was a level playing field. You know, the teacher was also the student. And so we were encouraged to share with each other, and as we learned things, to bring that back to the group. And it was open and dynamic enough that, you know what, you found something, you know, share it with the group. So research is something that I just loved and gravitated to and really appreciated. And so, you know, it was great that, okay, why don't you facilitate the next meeting? So it's also trusting yourself, that the mentors are like, you know, hey, come in, you know, it's kind of a each one teach one. As you learn something, or if you have a particular skill, share that with the group. And I think it speaks back to, as Daryl was speaking, you know, as the organization grows, right, more people are coming in, then Camille has provided me with this. Now, Adrian, you take that information and you pass it, each one pass it along. And so I think that Canopy is not just building a top-down organization. It is, we want to build a team of people that we can now take this back to our communities. We're in those communities, and hopefully we can share what we've learned and become the teachers and inform people on how they can take the tools that we've learned and pass that along.
Very much so. I remember in, you know, going through the curriculum and the syllabus, and getting so excited about the topics that we were going to be discussing, because as a journalist, this was continuing education for me. So I got excited about the workshops that were being facilitated by journalists who were so generative and generous with their time and resources. And these are journalists that also, you know, lent themselves to mentoring on a one-on-one basis as well. And we wanted to really pair the fellows with mentors that matched not only their existing skill set, but what they aspired, you know, toward. So that was part of the process as well. And you know, so after you all kind of got into your groups, your separate groups, you kind of developed your own dynamic as well. So outside of the 2 Zoom meetings, you all had meetings as well to suss out any issues that we were dealing with in terms of reporting and researching on the story. Is that right?
Yeah, so it was, so I was well, first of all, we were selected the stories. We were presented with the stories, and we had the option to choose the stories that we wanted to work on. And for me, I chose the West End Mall story, and it was an interesting story in that you know, I'm very familiar with the West End Mall, but what this story exposed us to a lot. I mean, we learned a lot about opportunity zones, this new program. We learned a lot about the history of this mall, and you know, a lot of people from the outside, you look and it's aged. You know, it's been there for over 50 years, but it's once you start peeling away and start learning the legacy, how it has been an institution and a cultural icon, a meeting place for the community. It's offered up jobs. It has served this community well, but there's so much uncertainty about the future of it. And when you start seeing that the nervousness about this, the community has this nervousness about development coming in. They want development, but there's this question of, well, what about us? So our job was to, okay, let's go learn what is the future of West End Mall? Can we answer those kind of questions? And we felt empowered to go in and, you know, Brent, you know, did interviews with Orion Gravel, you know, talked to and find out from the developers what their intentions were. Let's look at Invest Atlanta. How is Opportunity Zones doing in other neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta? You know, let's look at the census tract. What's happening in this local community? So it really exposed us to what looked like a very simple story, had many different layers to it once we started doing the research. And it was a really good experience in working with as a team and coming back in with dividing up the story. You know, I had opportunity zone research. Brent was looking at it from the personal stories of local business owners in the community. Ayana was looking at it from the community, the residents, and hearing their stories. Like you said, some of those stories, she actually did research. She sat on the front porch and talked to her neighbors. What do you think about the West End Mall? And those kind of things. So it was a great process of breaking down a story and then just going out and let the facts lead us back to what we find. And ultimately, you know, we had a story that we felt good submitting to you and the editors for your consideration.
I have to say, you know, you already know how proud I am of you and your efforts, as well as all of the fellows. I'm so thankful for the time and the commitment that you put into it. You all ended up coming with 2 long form, deeply researched, deeply nuanced stories of importance in the West End, one being the West End Mall story that was your team, and then the other story being the art story. And I want everyone to, you know, seal Adrian's name into your minds, because her byline has been appearing after the fellowship, you know, in different spaces. She did some work on MARTA and on voter turnout. So this fellowship, I'm hoping that it has, you know, given her some additional skills so that she can continue reporting in the community. And that was one of the things that we looked at with the applicants, is what is the likelihood of them continuing to do this type of community journalism work. And that is something that we looked for. And Adrian is and her efforts outside of that is exemplary of that. Okay. So thank you, Adrian, so much for breaking that down for us. Just the only thing I have left is that we hit send, we hit publish, and it went live, and thousands of people read our stories. We even formed partnerships with existing media like Atlanta Magazine. One of our fellows, Abu Bakar, actually worked on the story for one of the other 4 stories on the Waterboy story that was co-published in Atlanta Magazine, and our food story that looked at urban farming in West End was co-published with Scalawag. Our West End, you know, narrative story, an ode to West End, was co-published with Butter ATL. So we are positioning ourselves to be very complementary to existing media systems. But the full circle moment for us was when we were able to publish 3 of our stories in the print version of Canopy. The print version of Owen, which is the newsletter that Brent Brewer, who was one of our fellows, that he publishes, and it has been publishing for decades. And that speaks to our concerns with access. We want to make sure that everyone who has a chance to read the stories, and we were able to distribute the print version of the Owen newsletter on election day. And that was because of a grant that we received from the Economic Hardship Reporting Project to print and distribute our stories in the newsletter. So that was us, you know, like we intended to at the beginning, fortifying existing media systems and information systems in West End. And between print copies and, you know, series of online events where we partnered with Elevate Atlanta, we had office hours. We have one coming up where we're going to be having a panel discussion on Waterboy, and the Waterboy story that was featured and in the larger issue that was written by the issue editor, who was Gavin Godfrey. That's all coming up, and that just goes to our intentions to just make sure that we continue to be there and be a resource, and for the communities that we're focusing on. So that's what I have for community engagement. I want to hand it over now to Marianne Martin, who has a fun exercise for you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Camille, so much for that. That was just a beautiful story told by you and Adrian. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon and being a part of this webinar. We really appreciate your time and commitment to learning more about community engagement. My name is Marianne, and I am a co-founder at Canopy Atlanta, and headed up, or with the help of all my fellow co-founders, worked on community engagement in the West End for our first issue. Before we talk a little bit about an exercise I'd like for everyone to do, just wanted to remind everyone about that event that Camille mentioned. We have a Waterboys panel discussion coming up this Thursday at 6:30, and that is with Gavin Godfrey, the writer who wrote that story. It was one of our most popular stories on Canopy Atlanta, and would love for you all to join that. If you can just hop over to either our Facebook page or our website, you'll see information about how to sign up for that event. Like I said, it's this Thursday at 6:30, and would love to have you all join there. And also want to remind everyone that today is Giving Tuesday, and that we would really appreciate any donations. We do have a triple match on the table right now, which means that any donation that you make, $1, we will receive $3. So if you go to canopyatlanta.org/donate, you will see that information, how to do that. So thank you very much for that. So moving on, and thank you, Max, for doing the slides for us. Moving on to just wanted everybody that is able to maybe do a quick exercise on community engagement and kind of thinking about how you think about community engagement and if there are ways that you can, think differently about it. One thing that we often talk about with Canopy Atlanta is that every community is so different, and it's so important to think about what makes a community unique and what engagement works with a particular community, particularly as Camille talked about with Brent Brewer in our West End newsletter. We probably won't have that in another community that we go, but hopefully we can learn what is unique about that community and what community engagement might look like so that we can work with the community instead of that more extractive journalism where you're just going in and writing what you think the story is. So I'd like for everyone who is on here, you can either just do this on your own, or if you want to drop it in the chat, I can kind of share it with everybody, since I know that you're all muted. But choose a neighborhood or community you know well. This can be, a neighborhood that you live in, maybe the neighborhood you grew up with in. So if you can just think of what neighborhood that might be, and perhaps it's a neighborhood you just recently moved into, and then think about how you get information about that particular neighborhood. And is it Facebook groups? I mean, I was just thinking about, we just moved this spring into a new neighborhood, and I was thinking about how did I learn about that neighborhood? I know for me, it was a Facebook group, which is probably what a lot of people do, but also talking to neighbors. So I'm just curious if anybody wants to kind of share some of the things in the questions. So I've got some of those coming through now. Jefferson Park, East Point, Georgia are some of the neighborhoods people are picking, and wondering how you get your information in those neighborhoods. Facebook groups, speak with neighbors. Try to avoid Nextdoor. I am not on Nextdoor, but I've heard some horror stories. So that is an interesting comment. Although I'm sure there's probably good information on Nextdoor as well. We've got some people are thinking of City Atlanta, Cleveland Avenue, and information from Decatur-ish, shout out for Decatur-ish, Dan Wisenhunt, who does great work over there. So now I'd like most of the info from Nextdoor and the news. There's a lot of different local news. We have someone saying flyers posted at neighborhood grocery stores, walking the neighborhood. I think that's all something we've been doing about during this pandemic is walking through our neighborhoods probably a lot more than we have in the past. And Sonam, who was on, was saying, what about bulletin boards, community stores? I know there's some really great local community stores in the Atlanta areas, local restaurants, neighborhood association groups. So those are some of the sort of, I think, very organic ways that we gather information when we think about living in a community or being in a community. But I would also like for us to think now a little more differently about how we get information when we're looking to do community engagement at work or with our work, because I think often what we do is approach it differently. I know in the past, I have certainly, before getting involved in Canopy Atlanta and really thinking about community engagement and community-led work, If somebody would have asked me how to learn about a neighborhood, I probably would have pulled data, and not that any of these ways are wrong or incorrect, but I probably would have done much more generic things, you know, handed out questionnaires, handed out flyers, sort of much more ways that are not necessarily directly talking to and listening to neighbors. So I'm curious, in the past, as you have done community engagement work, what ways, you know, specifically with your work environment, what are ways that you have engaged with various communities in the past? Does anybody have any feedback, or can drop something in the chat that you can think of, that ways you've used in the past? I don't see any coming through right now yet. The other question I would, you know, have you think about is groups that you don't hear from in your neighborhood engagement. One person says the community where I work has a community channel. That's great. Expensive but effective during this time is to mail surveys to targeted areas to get input. So it's great in underserved communities. Surveys, that's one thing that we had talked with the West End, is doing surveys, but obviously, as this person noted, you know, that can be expensive. Look for people who were the connectors. That is something that is always just such a great way to do community engagement. It's something that we used a lot in the West End, is as we did, you know, call people, interviewed people, talk to people, we would say, who else do we need to talk to? And we found so many people who were those connectors in communities. I'm curious if anybody has any feedback on specific groups or demographic, maybe age groups that you struggle to hear from in community engagement. And I know one of the things that we talked about a lot with the West End was trying to reach a population that is not necessarily online or on social media. Sometimes those are older people, and the people have actually lived in the community the longest, and trying to find ways, because if you do kind of the usual, you know, Facebook group, email, those are the people that likely will not get those emails or fill out those surveys. And so I know that's one challenge that we really, and as Sonam and Camille both mentioned, you know, going out on the porches, talking to people, and hopefully we'll be able to do more of that, looking for ways that we can target groups that may not be in kind of the traditional channels that you think about. So I guess, you know, kind of the goal for us at Canopy Atlanta, and hopefully the goal for everyone who is interested in thinking more about community engagement is thinking of ways that we can have engagement that is organic and community led, and that is not necessarily just another, you know, demographic profile or whatever that may be. And I'm seeing some comments come through now. Working parents are difficult to reach. 35 and under is usually pretty hard. That's interesting to get that. Housing, transitional housing renters, folks under 25. And I would definitely agree that those were some of the folks that we struggled here in the West End, and you know, interesting. And I think it's important, maybe the first step is important to think about, you know, who we aren't reaching, and to recognize that, and to then think about ways that those folks interact with their communities. So, you know, like the under 25 group or something like that. And one person has commented about the notion of hard to reach. Some groups being hard to reach? Are they hard to reach, or what, are we not reaching them on their terms? Which is an excellent point. Because yeah, and I think I've actually used that term several times. You know, we found groups that were hard to reach, but were they hard to reach, or were we not reaching out in the right ways or in the right places, or where those groups actually interacted? So that's an interesting point as well. Well, thank you so much for being involved in this and listening. And we'll take a couple more questions if anybody has any specific questions. Do we know if, I think there were a few questions at the beginning for Daryl. Do we know if Daryl is still available for questions, if I could throw those questions to him, or if anybody has any other questions for Camille or Adrian or Sonam? So this is the question, going back to what Daryl mentioned about distrust. Can you discuss whether Canopy encountered that and what you all did to ameliorate any distrust? Great question. Sonam, why don't we go to you for that question?
That is a really good question. Yeah, so I mean, I think someone else brought up this point about people who are connectors in neighborhoods, and I would say, you know, I don't think we particularly encountered much distrust, because I don't think any sort of like distrust that we actually encountered was more just like, oh cool, like another new group coming into a neighborhood, like we've seen this before, which is completely true. You know, like we started out with this like listening survey, and it's just like, you know, if you live in like West End, you've seen like a million different like listening surveys. Okay, so I think that we definitely encountered that kind of fatigue of just like, okay, well, what is this? Like, is it actually going to, you know, do anything interesting? And there might be people who, and we would love to hear from them, so that maybe thought that it wasn't that interesting. But what I will say is that I think by partnering with existing information systems, like we've been saying, and existing people who already had different types of connections or status in the community, rather than trying to just like kind of create that on our own, that's what helped cultivate trust. And again, you know, spending the amount of time that we did, which I really cannot understate, was a lot of time. And I'm saying that because if you want to do this and really cultivate these relationships, like that does take time, resources, you know, an ability to kind of like leverage those kinds of things. But the payoff is that I think we did cultivate generally a lot more trust than we would have otherwise. And I think that came from just being, you know, on the phone for 2 hours with probably like one of my favorite conversations this year was with Mr. Handy Johnson in West End, one of the longest residents in West End, who just had incredible stories to share about West End. And I don't think that we would have earned Mr. Johnson's trust unless we had spent that time talking to him. And I'm really grateful that we were able to.
Thank you for that. Yeah, definitely, I would agree. It was kind of like that, oh, really, another survey to fill out feedback in the beginning. Some other questions that we have, and it looks like Daryl is maybe answering this on here. Will City Bureau expand to new markets? And Daryl says we will be looking for new documenters, network partners in 2021. We'll have a proper intake system for it next year. But if anyone is interested in talking further, please reach out. Daryl@citybureau.org, and maybe we can, if someone wants to, if you can't get that or whatever, you can email us, but we'll be happy to share Daryl's information. But that's Daryl@citybureau.org, and so he says email them directly, or they'll have a more official system in 2021. Another question that we had, can you share more about what tracking impact looks like, particularly beyond clicks and reading? Are there models that you're using? Is there a framework you draw upon?
I would again direct people to some of City Bureau's amazing resources. They have this great post that I think Daryl helped author or was the lead author on, was it's called Metrics to Match Our Mission. And as he said, they went through this whole process, I think for much of the last year, to kind of rethink about how we define impact. And, you know, the question about like, beyond clicks and reading, you know, we do want to pay attention to that a little bit, like depending on, you know, but I think beyond just the clicks, we want to pay attention to things like, are people coming to us through mobile or desktop? How are we designing our website? Is that, is it designed for accessibility for mobile? And that is like a more interesting impact metric than say just the number of clicks. And then I think, of course, there's a much more qualitative. I think we're using a mixture of quantitative and qualitative. Some of the quantitative things might be things like, we had this original mandate from our community advisory board and from a lot of the people that we spoke to at the front of this process. What do they think about it at the back end of this process? And we might have things like rate it on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10, that kind of thing. And that's something that we're collecting right now. But also we want to have really qualitative conversations with folks too. And a lot of those things we've gotten from social media, but a lot of them, I think we're gonna have to go back on the phone as well. We released this issue about a month ago, and so we're still in the process of collecting all of those stuff. But I think that's a really great question. How do we redefine what impact looks like so that it makes a much more, so that matches our mission in a way that's beyond just a business model? And Camille, I mean, I would love to hear how you define impact for your fellows too.
Yeah, just a qualitative example is when Adrian actually told me, I believe it was yesterday or this morning, that there was some kind of issue. Someone was having some kind of issue, and the first thing they said was, "Tell Adrian about it," right? So that she can get to researching it and reporting on it, knowing that there might possibly be limitations in terms of like broader impact, but at least the process can be started to see who do you need to speak to begin to resolve this problem. And I look at that as just a huge success, that the people in West End and the surrounding neighborhoods now have a journalist, and 6 journalists that they can say, okay, we have this issue. We know that we have someone that we can go to directly that is not going anywhere. And that's also something that Adrian has mentioned before, just about the fact that in terms of impact, the fact that they live in the community. So they see each other at the grocery stores, they drive by each other, like all the time. So they have something to say about, feedback for the stories that they're writing or the reporting that they're doing. They have access to them. And that was one of the major tenets of Canopy's mission.
Yeah, also just like, what are we able to, what is the capacity that's been built? And I think there are a lot of different ways to measure that as well. I know one of our other fellows, Abubakar, he is a photographer and did photography for our really wonderful Water Boys story, among others. And he went to go cover some of the protests that occurred after the verdict in the shooting of Breonna Taylor. And he documented some of that on Instagram and social media, and unfortunately had this experience of being tear gassed for the first time, which if you've been to a protest in the last year, that is pretty common circumstance, unfortunately. But we asked him, we're so glad you went. We're so glad that you documented this. Like, do you feel like you would have been able to do that before having this fellowship? And he said no. Like, he said that going through this process, being able to connect with professional journalists, being able to connect with Camille and other fellows, really gave him that kind of confidence too. And I think that is the kind of impact that we're trying to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think we are about ready to wrap up here, but had a quick question for Adrian, if she can hop back up on the screen. I think it's a great one, so we'd love to get this one in. Adrian, here's a question for you. I want to know more about Adrian's opinions about public access TV and shoring up the First Amendment activities of journalism through nonprofit organizations. Okay, I think you're muted. Adrian, I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. So very quickly, so for more than 20 years, I've been engaged in public access television here in the city of Atlanta. And community media has been a shift in the public access television community. I think that institutions such as City Bureau and Canopy Atlanta is a model of where it's empowering people, training people, giving them the tools to be able to tell their own story, to realign where journalists, media makers with the community, as opposed to being separate and apart. These information networks are becoming closer to the community. And back to the issue of trust, we trust our neighbors. So for too often, journalists were these unknown people. We saw their bylines, but we didn't know them. So when they come into our community, dip in and dip back out, we don't know. And then it's going through editors who might not frame the story as we intended. So bringing them closer together and spending that time together, we're now building these relationships that over time result in the trust, result in the accountability, and is more reflective of what the community's mission is. And so for me, this is absolutely an extension of the public access TV movement, and now presenting people with the skills and tools to be able to do journalism that more reflects the community and embeds them closer together. So, you know, it's been a great experience, and I think that I'm glad to see that it's now in the South, and hopefully, just like City Bureau has expanded, Canopy's vision of expanding through Metro Atlanta is going to be a very powerful resource for our communities. And so I think 2021 is going to be a world of possibilities for us. So thanks again, guys.
Couldn't say it any better than that. Thank you so much, Adrian. We'll end on that. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Check us out at canopyatlanta.org.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for taking some time to chat with us today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you'll be able to access the recording of this webinar on our webinar page by the end of the week, and you can also look there for upcoming webinars. I've shared that again in the chat box with you all. I would like to thank everyone for attending today, and for to thank our wonderful panelists once again. Next Tuesday, December the 8th at 2:30 p.m., we will be hosting another webinar. That one will be on the Metro Atlanta Speaks results for 2020. That webinar will go deeper on this year's survey results, from about how the pandemic has impacted employment, housing, and hunger, to how insights into the state insights into the state of relations, race relations in the region. On behalf of the Atlanta Regional Commission and our presenters, thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful day.